Last time we explored well-known topics about World War I, like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand or the Russian Revolution. But today we dive deeper, exploring entries such as boomerang grenades or the Mad Baron, who thought he was a reincarnated form of Genghis Khan. Stick around and explore the deeper parts of the World War I iceberg with me. Apologies if I sound a bit nasal, but I'm a bit sick. Czechoslovak Legion. The Czechoslovak Legion was a force of, who guessed it, predominantly Czechs and Slovaks, fighting on the side of the Entente and later the White Army in the Russian Civil War. In the first months of World War I, the Czechs and Slovaks were very enthusiastic about the war effort and fought alongside the Austro-Hungarians. However, this then turned to apathy, and the first detachment of troops defected from Austria-Hungary in October 1914 and joined the Russians on the Eastern Front. When the Czechoslovaks were allowed to take in their POWs as soldiers in their legions, they grew to 2 divisions of around 40,000 men by 1918. Some regiments were even founded in Italy and France, fighting on their respective fronts. These soldiers fought alongside the Entente since the Czechoslovaks had hoped to gain their support, so that the Czechoslovaks would gain their own independent nation-state, free from Austria-Hungary. They were mostly known for their fighting in the White Russian Army in the Russian Civil War, where they took over key cities like Kazan, where they stole the Imperial Gold Reserve and infrastructure, namely the Trans-Siberian Railway. When Czechoslovakia proclaimed its independence in October 1918, the Legion yearned for its homeland and prepared an evacuation of their troops from Vladivostok and the far east of Russia. In 1920, around 67,000 Czechoslovaks evacuated from Vladivostok and returned back to their homeland. There are still lots of mysteries about especially the gold they had stolen from Kazan. People claim some of the gold went missing alongside the Trans-Siberian Railway or strewn around deep Siberia, but modern historians say this gold has very likely been entirely transferred to the Red Army. Yet many still spread theories around it. You could very well fill an entire video about the stories of the Czechoslovak Legion, and I may do a video about the Russian Revolution and its mysteries, so let me know if you want to see that. The African Theater. It's in the name. World War I was fought around the world, even in Africa. Germany held vast colonies in Africa prior to the outbreak of the war, and were not very well defended, and thus combat was largely done via guerrilla warfare, and not via direct warfare. Colonial forces were poorly equipped, small forces to maintain internal order, rather than engaging in combat with other colonial forces. Though the continent saw combat all over its territories, I'll focus on German East Africa for this entry. Around 2,500 soldiers, of which 2,100 Askaris, which were native Africans, were stationed to protect German East Africa. When the war broke out, fighting was sparse, as British-Belgian forces and German forces were both pretty tiny, but the general for colonial troops, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, planned to tie up as many troops as possible in East Africa to pull away strength from the British. Up until 1916, Lettow-Vorbeck managed to fend off Entente troops pretty successfully, given he was vastly outnumbered. The British had then mobilized Commonwealth forces, namely Indian, numbering a staggering 250,000 soldiers against around 22,000 German forces. In late 1917, the Germans were forced into the south of East Africa and crossed over into neutral Portuguese Mozambique, plundering their supply hubs for rations and much-needed guns and ammunition. Lettow-Vorbeck returned mid-1918 to East Africa and entered North Rhodesia, which was under British rule, where he had then surrendered after hearing news of the German surrender, late 1918. All in all, warfare in Africa was not fought via direct combat, but rather trying to disrupt enemy forces, which largely left the countryside desolate, as the forces stole supplies, and even men, and many natives died due to starvation or disease because of this. Lettow-Vorbeck was famous for being the only German commander to ever invade British territory in World War I. Asia-Pacific Theater. Same as the last entry, World War I was also fought in Asia and the Pacific, though at a much smaller scale than even the African theater. Much of the fighting occurred in the siege of Qingdao or Tsingtao, which was defended by a garrison of around 3,600 Germans, supported by 100 Chinese and a few Austro-Hungarian soldiers. On the 31st of October 1914, Japanese troops, numbering 23,000 men along with 1,500 British troops, bombarded the fort at Qingdao with multiple battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and more. The garrison surrendered the next day, knowing their defeat was nigh, and no support would come from the homeland. Some more fighting occurred in the German colony of German New Guinea, namely at the Battle of Beta Parker, not Peter Parker, where a few hundred Australians engaged 300 Germans. When the Australians won, the Germans retreated to Toma and were soon after besieged and then surrendered. The minor isolated battles occurred deep in the jungle of New Guinea, but ceased very quickly. The German holdings in the Pacific were taken without any resistance, namely by the Japanese, who then held these islands after the war, and was a large contributor to World War II. In any case, German resistance was futile, and even the navy stationed in East Asia retreated as soon as war broke out, knowing they will not be able to stand a chance against the Allies. I find these small skirmishes and battles interesting, because it goes to show that the war really did take place in the most isolated pockets of the world, where no one would expect that, but I personally think that deserves more recognition. Cher Ami, French for dear friend, was a male homing pigeon born in Norfolk, England, 1918, known for his military service in World War I. Homing pigeons, or most commonly known as carrier pigeons, were used for millennia due to their ability to navigate home easily, and both the Entente and Central Powers made use of these pigeons as a sort of last resort. When all other communications failed, these pigeons, along with Cher Ami, were stationed in North France, and Cher Ami was one of 60 pigeons assigned to the mobile loft number 11. Cher Ami helped in delivering messages in the Battle of Verdun, but perhaps was mostly known for his duty in saving the Last Battalion, which I'll explain in the next entry in more detail, so I'll keep it short here. Essentially, Cher Ami was the last of multiple pigeons desperately delivering a message by cut-off American troops surrounded by German forces. They were subjected to friendly fire due to inaccurate coordinates, and had little rations, supplies, and even had suffered major casualties. Cher Ami then delivered the message to nearby American forces and stopped the friendly fire. He suffered multiple injuries and was shipped off to the US, where he then died in 1919 in New Jersey. Cher Ami was awarded the Croix de Guerre with a palm oak leaf cluster and was posthumously bestowed the Animals in War and Peace Medal of Bravery in the US. He, along with Sergeant Stubby, which I mentioned in the last part of the Iceberg, are now at display at the National Museum of American History and are the true heroes of World War I. The Lost Battalion. As said in the previous entry, Cher Ami and the Lost Battalion go hand in hand, and it isn't really possible to talk about one without mentioning the other. The Lost Battalion refers to 9 companies of the US 77th Division who got lost behind enemy lines in October 1918 and suffered heavy casualties and were then rescued later by Allied forces. Even though it is called the Lost Battalion, the force actually consisted of companies from 4 different battalions and totaled around 545 men. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll refer to them as the Lost Battalion anyways. This attack was a part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which began in late September 1918, and General Evan Johnson, who was in charge of a large part of the offensive, ordered a no-retreat command to his divisions, saying that if any officer is ordered to retreat or fall back, they are considered traitors. On October 1st, the Lost Battalion was ordered to push through the Ravine de Charlevaux to secure key supply lines, which was a part of a larger offensive with the French and another American division. But unbeknownst to Major Whittlesey, the 2 divisions were forced to fall back due to a large counterattack by the Germans, exposing both the left and right flank. Whittlesey and his men realized only later on, after they captured a hill, that they were surrounded by the Germans. Whittlesey sent multiple runners to re-establish contacts with his flanks and request support, but none of the runners returned. The more time passed, the more they realized the dire situation. On the 4th, they were the target of Allied artillery fire. It's uncertain how it happened, and historians debate whether Whittlesey relayed the wrong coordinates or the artillery aim was off, but in any case, friendly fire claimed lots of men's life. And this is when Cher Ami was allegedly sent off with a message to stop the artillery fire, as said in the previous entry. The battalion was running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, as the number of casualties ran higher and higher, and German attacks became more prevalent, but the pocket held their ground, though on the 8th, a week before first being encircled, the 77th Infantry Division was linked up with Whittlesey's men, and troops came to their rescue. Out of over 500 soldiers, only 194 walked out unscathed. Germany helped Lenin. Lenin, The famous Russian revolutionary who helped spur on and lead the October Revolution in Russia was in Poland when World War I broke out and was arrested and briefly imprisoned by the Austro-Hungarian police due to his Russian citizenship, was then later released after explaining his anti-Tsarist sympathies. In February 1916, he moved to Zurich in Switzerland, and in April attended the Kienthal Conference, which was an international conference of socialists who opposed World War I. Stating he wants to convert the imperialist war to a continent-wide civil war, with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie and aristocracy. When the February Revolution deposed the Tsar and converted Russia into a republic, he and others celebrated. He decided to take charge of the Bolsheviks in Russia and devised a plan to return to Russia, but he realized he couldn't pass through because of ongoing fights in the Eastern Front. However, he and other sympathizers negotiated with the German government to take a train ride to St. Petersburg. The Germans fabricated a cover story and sent Lenin via sealed train, which was actually financed by the Kaiser himself, off through Germany to Sweden and finally Finland, arriving at St. Petersburg in April 1917. While he was on the train, he wrote his April theses outlining his plans for the Bolsheviks, namely the rule by Soviets, peace with the Central Powers, nationalization of industry and banks, and the state expropriation of land. Spreading into the Bolshevik meetings in St. Petersburg. I could talk on and on about Lenin, but I will cut it short here and talk about the German part of the century. Why would the Germans release Lenin, who praised communist ideals? A threat to a monarchist Germany? Well, the German High Command wanted Russia to be knocked out of the war badly, since troops stationed there could then be pulled back to the Western Front, which was essentially just a stalemate at this point in time. The hope was that Lenin could destabilize Russia enough for high officials to negotiate an immediate peace with the Central Powers, and sending off key Bolshevik figures like Lenin could undermine Russian war efforts, and in the end, it worked, but it also plunged Russia into a brutal civil war. Nurse Margaret Mall. In 2013, a battered suitcase was dug up in the back of a cupboard in the University of Aberdeen, Dundee, Scotland, containing memorabilia of a nurse called Margaret Mall, who cared for wounded soldiers in World War I. Information about Mall is very scarce, and we basically have no idea of her personal life, and no one really knows how or why the suitcase got there in the first place, since Mall never actually traveled to Dundee. The suitcase contained documents from 1914, but also syringes, autographs, photographs, letters, and newspaper articles from French, British, and German soldiers she helped. From what letters show us, she was quite a beloved nurse. There are lots of messages from soldiers she had helped, thanking her for saving their lives and even writing poems. Nurse Mall helped wounded men from all battlefields, no matter their country of origin, seeing these wounded men as people first and soldiers second. Researchers have been able to find out that she had been born in Paisley in 1887, turned to be a nurse in Glasgow between 1914 to 17, then was transferred to Kent in 1918, and then was transferred to Kent in late 1917. After that, nothing is known, up until 1969, where she had then retired after 52 years of nursing at the age of 82. It's quite an interesting story to hear about, since it's strange no records have been found of her, other than this one suitcase, and a place where she had never actually been in. Florentine diamond, also known as the Tuscany diamond, or the Austrian diamond, is a pretty large and old diamond, weighing 137.2 carats, approximately as large as a walnut, which went missing in World War I. It is yellow and was in the shape of a briolette, the shape seen on screen right now, and was very clear from the inside. No one really knows where the diamond came from. There are, however, 3 different versions. Version number 1 reports that the diamond was cut as a gift for the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold. Charles is then said to have been wearing the diamond when fighting in the Battle of Nancy in January 1477, which was then found by a peasant or foot soldier after the battle concluded. Thinking it was glass, he then sold it for 2 francs, no more than $100 today, to Bartholomew May, who then sold it to the Genoese. The Genoese then sold it to the Duke of Milan, Ludovicus Sforza, who might then have sold it to the Pope Julius II. Pope Pius V sold it to the House of Medici, who were large owners of land in Tuscany, where the diamond then got its name from. After the Austrian Habsburgs took hold of Tuscany, the diamond reportedly remained in Austrian possession, thus lasting until World War I. Version number 2 reports largely the same origin as the first version, only that Henry VIII of England allegedly bought it in 1547. Due to a royal marriage between Philip II of Spain and Mary I of England, the diamond then went to the Habsburgs again. The version number 3 claims the diamond was stolen in India by the Portuguese, who sold it to the Duke of Tuscany Ferdinand I, and then fell into the Habsburgs' hands the same way as version number 2. In any case, the diamond was kept in the Austrian imperial treasury for a long time, until it was ordered to be removed by Emperor Charles I of Austria at the end of World War I. However, it was stolen by someone close to the royal family sometime after 1918, taken to South America with other crown jewels. From then on, nothing is certain anymore. The diamond likely was cut up multiple times to erase its history. Some believe the Florentine diamond was cut up and sold in the US, as a 99.52 carat yellow diamond showed up at an American auction in 1923. Another more recent sighting was in 1981, where an 81.56 unnamed yellow diamond showed up at an auction in Switzerland. In the end, nothing is actually certain about this diamond other than the Habsburg possession and it being stolen. The crucified soldier. The crucified soldier is exactly what it says. Eyewitnesses saw that in spring 1915, a Canadian soldier or officer was crucified by German soldiers onto a tree or barn door somewhere near Ypres on May 10, 1915. The Times reported a short piece reporting that wounded Canadian soldiers near Ypres saw an officer being crucified to a wall by bayonets thrust into his hands, feet, and throat before being killed via bullet fire. The story varied often. Sometimes he was Canadian, other times he was British. In one version he was a regular soldier, and in another he was a sergeant or officer. Sometimes it was a barn or fence, sometimes a tree. You get the point. There is no real evidence supporting any of this. Only eyewitness accounts purported by fear and war weariness. However, in 2002, British documentarian Ian Overton investigated this, along with other myths, and allegedly identified the crucified soldier as Canadian Sergeant Harry Band, who was reported missing in action in April 1915 near Ypres, lining up with the eyewitness accounts. 2 notes were used as evidence, but no real substantial evidence was given. So many people think this is just one of these urban legends surfacing in World War I, akin to the Angel of Mars. Mystery of Celtic Wood. This refers to the disappearance of 71 men of the 10th Battalion of the 1st Australian Division in Celtic Wood near Passchendaele in West Flanders. After winning minor battles on the Western Front, British High Command believed that the 4th German Army was about to collapse, and thus ordered an offensive to capture Passchendaele Ridge, a part of the famous First Battle of Passchendaele. In early October 1917, the 10th Battalion was ordered to raid Celtic Wood, a small wooded area, to blow up German dugouts. This attack was just a diversion for the main attack, which was going to commence just after Celtic Wood. While the raid on Celtic Wood was unsuccessful, German forces pulled back out and it became a no-man's land. The mystery starts here, as the commander after the fact could only account for 14 of the 85 men coming out of the forest alive, leaving 71 men disappearing in Celtic Wood. Due to misreporting and ambiguous sources, many today believe 37 men actually went missing and the rest to be wounded, not to be killed in action, or alive. In 2008, researchers claimed to have solved the mystery, blaming fog of war, misreporting, and clerical errors to be at fault for the confusion. Celtic Wood was actually raided once before the 10th Battalion attacked, leading the Germans to reinforce the location with more machine guns and tougher defenses. When the 10th attacked, lots of them were mowed down by machine gun fire, while the rest was unable to retreat due to German artillery fire bombarding the location. The 37 men were likely killed by this artillery fire. Afterwards, the men dying in the machine gun fire, nor the men dying in the artillery barrage, could be identified, probably being the cause for this confusion. In the end, it likely isn't a mystery at all, but simply misreporting, bad record keeping, and confusion. Chemical weapon disappearances. As many of us know, World War I saw the use of chemical weapons, namely tear gas, phosgene, chlorine, and most famously mustard gas. This was used mainly by the Central Powers, but also the Allies, though to a lesser extent, and caused asphyxiation, pulmonary edemas, which is when fluid accumulates in the lungs, blisters, vomiting, and both external and internal bleeding. causing the patient to feel excruciating pain. In total, some 66 million gas shells were fired during the war, and a total of 125 million tons of toxic gases were used via the grenades, cylinders, bombs, mines, and canisters. In any case, chemical warfare was banned after World War I and the Geneva Protocols in 1925. This prohibited the usage of chemical weapons, but did not prohibit the production or stockpiling. This means that a lot of the nation's weapons remained unused, not even accounting for the around 30% of munitions remaining undetonated. An estimated 10 million abandoned or lost chemical munitions have yet to be retrieved or destroyed. With the signing of the Geneva Protocol, many men, women, and children began collecting the scrap metals of these munitions, including unexploded mines and bombs, causing many casualties. It became common practice for authorities to blow up unexploded weapons, but also many chemical weapons were still in stockpile. Then most of these munitions were just dumped into the sea, hoping that any toxic material would just dissolve or be diluted in the sea. This leaves an eerie reminder that a lot of the munitions are still unexploded or at the bottom of the ocean, showing the impact the war had on the environment and the people living around these areas. Attack of the Dead Men. The Attack of the Dead Men refers to a counterattack on Osowiec's fortress, present-day northeastern Poland, by Russian troops on August 6, 1915. The fortress was strategically important to both sides and had already withstood multiple German assaults since 1914. This time, however, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg ordered the usage of chemical weapons to take over the fortress once and for all. Early that morning, the Germans with their 14 battalions, around 7,000 men, released chlorine and bromine into the Russian line of trenches. The 13th Company of the 266th Russian Infantry Regiment, originally around 800 men strong, was reduced to 60 to 100 men. When the Germans took over the fortress without resistance, the Russians launched their counterattack, heavily outnumbered and suffering from critical injuries due to the gas attack, which had actually formed acid inside their bodies, gnawing away at the organs from the inside. Shook to their bones, the Germans relinquished control over the fortress and fled in horror as they saw the Russians charging at them looking like walking corpses. German units reportedly abandoned their weapons and positions in chaos. However, the Russians could not hold the fortress so much longer due to them being heavily outnumbered and threatened with encirclement, and they destroyed much of the fortress as they retreated. You may know the Sabaton song Attack of the Dead Men, just one example of the huge amount of media this attack spawned. Who killed John Parr? Private John Henry Parr was a British reconnaissance cyclist of the 4th Battalion, Middlesex Regiment, which was one of the first British forces mobilized at the outbreak of World War I. And is believed to be the first British soldier to have been killed in World War I. A little fun fact, he actually joined the army when he was 15 years old in 1912, lying about his age just to enlist. On August 21st, 1914, as his first order, he was ordered to scout and locate German positions with another cyclist near the town of Aubourg, near Mons, Belgium. He likely scouted too far forward and encountered an advancing German cavalry patrol and was shot and killed, either when he was observing enemy movement or when he was trying to cover the retreat of his comrade. He was declared missing for months before being finally declared dead at the age of 17. This seems like a pretty solid case, right? But no German documents actually confirmed the kill. It could also be that he was shot via friendly fire during the very confusing starting phases of the war. He was buried in a cemetery near Mons, and poetically, and by pure coincidence, his grave lies directly opposite of a man called George Edwin Ellison, the last British casualty in World War I, meaning the first and the last casualty of the Great War lie opposite each other. Just food for thought. Kinmel Park Mutiny. The Kinmel Park Mutiny occurred in March 1919 at, who guessed it, Kinmel Park Camp near Bodle, Wales. I'm sorry, Welsh is really hard, I'm trying my best. About 15,000 Canadian soldiers were stationed in the camp and were awaiting their repatriation to Canada, but they grew increasingly frustrated, especially due to the poor shape the camp was in. It was muddy, overcrowded, low on rations, and their higher-ups were receiving pay while they didn't. Most importantly, they were tired of waiting for over 4 months. The mutiny started on the 4th of March when receiving news about another regiment being shipped to Canada ahead of them. They smashed into supply stores, seized food and liquor, looted canteens, and clashed with the local military police and officers. After restoring order, 5 Canadians were dead, 23 left wounded, 78 men arrested, of which 25 were convicted of mutiny and received relatively light sentences. This all just shows how much chaos was raging at the end of World War I, but the interwar period deserves its own iceberg. I might do that next, so who knows. SMUB-85. SMUB-85 was a German Type UB-3 coastal submarine for your Navy nerds, and a part of the Imperial German U-boat fleet, commissioned in late 1917. On April 30th, 1918, on her second voyage, she was supposed to patrol off the coast of Belfast, Northern Ireland, but the submarine was intercepted by British warship HMS Coreopsis II, as the submarine was not doing what a submarine should do, be submerged. It was swimming at the surface. At gunpoint, the 34 German sailors surrendered and were taken prisoner, pretty unusual in itself since U-boats typically were scuttled or fought to the last man to avoid capture of the vessel. When the captain-lieutenant was interrogated, he reported that the submarine had been attacked by a large sea monster the night before, damaging the vessel and forcing it to swim on the surface. It is said to be larger than the submarine and have glowing teeth and horns. The crew allegedly shot at the creature, and this fended off the creature, but damaging the submarine. While this sounds very cool, especially if you are into cryptids, the story is probably just made up, and the submarine simply had suffered mechanical failure due to the design flaws of that submarine. Interestingly, in October 2016, during work on an underwater cable, a possible submarine wreck was found off the Scottish coast, believed to be that of UB-85, but could possibly be of UB-82. So, was the UB-85 attacked by an actual sea monster, or is it just World War I myth-making like we saw in entries prior? You decide. Related to this, the scuttling of the German fleet. If you don't know, scuttling means intentionally letting your own ship sink to not let it get into the enemy's hand. After World War I, the Imperial German High Seas Fleet was stationed temporarily at Scapa Flow, near Scotland, while negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles were still taking place. By the summer of 1919, the fleet consisting of 74 warships, including 16 capital ships, of which 11 battleships and 5 heavy cruisers, 8 light cruisers, and 50 destroyers were waiting for months, along with their 4,800 men, for the fate of their ships. Fearing the British might seize the ships and potentially use them against Germany in the event that hostilities might resume, Admiral Ludwig von Reuter ordered the sailors to scuttle their ships on June 21, 1919. A week before the Treaty of Versailles was meant to be signed. At noon, the ships began to list and sink slowly, and some even capsized before settling beneath the waves. The remaining British sailors tried to stop the ships from sinking by beaching them, and the British managed to save a few ships, even by shooting at the Germans. But the vast majority was scuttled. The British decided to shoot since the armistice strictly forbade any scuttling, and the Germans had broken that. In total, 9 Germans were killed by the British, and 16 were wounded due to panic and chaos. Out of 74 ships, 52 were sunk, 15 out of 16 capital ships, 5 out of 8 light cruisers, and 32 of the 50 destroyers were sunk. The remaining ships were distributed among Allied navies, and over the years, a lot of the ships were raised out of the water and salvaged for scrap metal. There's actually a whole list of the ships, when they sunk and what happened to them on Wikipedia. I'll link it down below. It's pretty interesting. Crew of the Sabrina. The Sabrina was a 3-masted schooner weighing 189 tons and was launched in 1873, originally designed for shipping meat from Argentina to Britain. In 1917, she was being used to transport coal and military supplies between Britain and France. I've noticed that a lot of these mysteries have to do with the ocean, which is just so bizarre. Being on board a merchant ship at this time was not particularly nice, as the Germans had a large submarine fleet and famously had unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting any merchant ship. Commanded by Captain Martin, the Sabrina left Falmouth in Cornwall, England on September 15, 1917, with a large cargo of coal for Saint-Brieuc, France. Only 2 days later, the Sabrina was discovered off the coast of Cherbourg, without having suffered any damage apart from some disarrangement to her rigging, but mysteriously without her 23-man large crew. Now this alone is pretty strange, but especially during a major war, it would make a lot of sense to simply sink the ship instead of targeting the crew specifically, as it would also destroy the cargo on board, arguably the more important target than the crew. The British assumed that Sabrina was simply stopped by a German submarine and the crew ordered to abandon the ship, before being either taken prisoner or killed. However, no German records of an attack on the Sabrina was reported or logged. For this to make sense, the submarine would have had to been threatened itself by a British or French ship, thus having to act quickly. It simply took the crew prisoner instead of sinking the ship. Usually submarine captains would take something from the ship, most commonly the logbook, to prove the sinking, but its Sabrina was untouched, the logbook was still present and nothing out of the ordinary. The crew must have surrendered without the slightest resistance. Another plausible theory is that the crew mistook a distant submarine or perhaps rough weather and waves for an enemy attack, thus leaving the ship hastily to wash ashore. This does not explain the near-perfect condition Sabrina was left in. The Sabrina is one of the most popular ghost ship legends and still remains unsolved. Did a German submarine take the crew and murder them without leaving any bodies behind, or was the crew experiencing mass hysteria, leaving their ship fearing an enemy attack? We may never know. Dowsing. Dowsing, or water witching, is the practice of using rods, pendulums, sticks or other tools to detect hidden objects underground, typically water, oil, metal or gems. This was especially popular during the 1400s to 1500s, but was actually practiced for thousands of years and is considered pseudoscience, as you can't really locate something underground using sticks. Okay, cool, but what does that have to do with World War I? Well, dowsing was actually a thing well into the 20th century, even as far as the Vietnam War, and sometimes even practiced today. In World War I, after Allied troops landed at Gallipoli, soldiers realized there was not much fresh water around the area, as provisions were not planned. Water was shipped in by boat from Malta and carried up the beaches via tin cans and donkeys. But this became dangerous, as the waters around Gallipoli were littered with mines and submarines torpedoing the vessels. Thirsty soldiers are very quickly dead soldiers, so a solution had to be found. Engineers were tasked with digging up wells, but they repeatedly came up dry. Desperate, they tried dowsing to find water. One such man was Stephen Kelly, an Australian from the 3rd Light Horse Brigade, the same brigade that fought on the Neck actually, as mentioned in the last part, tasked with finding water, as the campaign was seriously about to collapse due to shortages. Kelly took on the mission and used this piece of copper, and found water very close to the division headquarters in Anzac Cove. When being opened up by engineers, it was found that over 2,000 gallons, or about 7,500 liters of fresh water per hour was provided by one well. Kelly had found many more pockets of water, opening up 32 wells in the area, providing water for over 100,000 men and thousands of mules, one of each drinking as much as 20 men. Kelly was personally congratulated by the general in command and was mentioned in dispatches for his service, and potentially saved thousands of lives with one piece of copper. Now, whether or not Kelly was just lucky and did a good acting job, or this definitely proves the effectiveness of dowsing, is up for you to decide. But it for sure is an interesting part of World War I personally have never heard of before. Henry Gunther. Henry Nicholas John Gunther was an American soldier of the 313th Infantry Regiment of the 79th Division, and is officially considered the last soldier that died in World War I. He was a supply sergeant and arrived in France in September 1918. Writing from there, he urged a friend of his to do anything to avoid getting drafted due to the miserable conditions of the front lines. This letter was intercepted, and he was demoted from sergeant to private. On the morning of November 11th, 1918, at 5 a.m. local time, the armistice was signed, declaring a ceasefire, which was to come into effect at 11 a.m., or poetically, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. This left 6 hours of additional fighting, and Henry Gunther reportedly was positioned near Chaumont-Devant-d'Anvillers in the Meuse region of France, when at 10:59 a.m. he charged toward a German machine gun position with his bayonet, shot once or twice, and was then killed with a short burst of machine gun fire, about 1 minute before the armistice was to take effect. The Germans waved and shouted at him to return to his position, as no more needless blood should be spilled, but Gunther would not listen. Gunther likely did this to redeem himself, as he probably was very worked up and ashamed about his demotion to private, driven by personal redemption to restore his honor, not to win a war that was already about to be won. In 1923, the US Army posthumously promoted him back to sergeant to honor his sacrifice, so he can rest easy now. Bertha Trost. Bertha Trost was born in Potsdam, Germany, and was a German socialite, clairvoyant, and beauty specialist. There is very little verifiable information about her, but she worked as a clairvoyant or fortune teller in Berlin, later moving to London in 1895. In London, she set up 2 beauty shops, regularly letting customers go into debt, to then acquire information as payment for the debt. It is probable she continued her spiritual readings in London as well, rumored to be actually just a cover for espionage. In 1915, she had heard her German son was captured by the British in combat, which alerted the British authorities, which then dug up her past and deported her for being a spy, even though she lived in Britain for over 30 years. After the war, any records completely vanish about her. We don't even know when she died. Her story is similar to that of Mata Hari, another kind of femme fatale figure, secretly spying for the enemy. Seances. Seances, French for session, describes the meeting of people trying to contact the dead or spirits, listening to their messages and trying to communicate with them. These seances make use of spirit boards, trumpets, table turning, a technique where everyone lays their hands onto a table and wait for rotations, and much more. Such spiritual techniques were commonplace during the 18th and 19th century, but waned during the early 20th century. During World War I, families were devastated by the loss of sons, brothers, and husbands, and turned to spiritualism as a source of comfort, seeking messages from these seances where the official sources gave no closure. These seances filled the emotional void the families were experiencing. Many people reported contacting their lost sons or husbands and relaying comforting messages like, "He is at peace," or "He still watches over you." The author of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, actually was a huge spiritualist, even before the war, and when he lost his son in 1918 due to pneumonia contracted at the front, his belief in the spiritual became even stronger, even writing a book on it called The Vital Message. Are the dead really dead? Many more examples like this exist, but many were also skeptical of such practices, calling seances elaborate hoaxes and confirmation bias. Whether or not these seances actually worked, they had profound positive impact on grieving families, giving comfort, closure, and reassurance. It was simply a great outlet and good coping mechanism, trying to process the collective trauma of a world shattered by industrial death. I find it so important to also talk about the home front, instead of focusing on battles, invasions, and politics. This war affected everyone, and I want to emphasize that, and I cannot grasp the amount of psychological trauma these people went through, even when not even fighting themselves. In any case, I oversimplified a lot here, and seances are much more complex than my overview. Let me know if you want a deeper dive on spiritualism as a whole. It is a fascinating topic, and I'm down to explore it with you guys. Georgian Legion. The Georgian Legion was a military formation of Georgian nationalists formed in 1915 under the sponsorship of the German Empire. In September 1914, the Committee of Independent Georgia was formed, shortly after World War I's outbreak by Georgian immigrants and students living in Germany, aiming to spread revolution and independence movements in the Caucasus region. The most notable figure was Leo Karasilidze, who later became the highest-ranked Georgian officer of the around 2,000 men-strong legion. The legion was raised as a way to undermine Russian influence and divert attention and resources from the more important Eastern Front, and was comprised of mainly Georgian exiles in Germany and Georgians living in the border regions of the Ottoman Empire, who had hoped for an independent Georgia. The Germans provided training and much-needed guns, while the Ottomans were wary about their independence movements and thought it would destabilize Ottoman control over the region. However, relations broke down in early 1917 between the Committee of Independent Georgia and the Ottomans, dissolving the legion entirely. Some of these men later would join the National Army of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, a short-lived Georgian state lasting from May 1918 to 1921, when it was invaded by the Soviet Union. Related to this is the German Caucasus Expedition, which was, you guessed it, a German expedition in the Caucasus, sent in June 1918, aimed at securing the vital resources in the Caucasus, namely the oil fields at Baku, and to stabilize the pro-German Georgian state. They actually stayed there till January 1919, and was a large 19,000-man force. In any case, Georgia is just one part of a lot of independence movements throughout the later stages of the war, and very well deserves its own iceberg. The artist J.M. The artist J.M. refers to an anonymous artist going by the initials J and M, who drew 123 pen and ink sketches depicting the war from both sides in a mostly satirical, but also sometimes realistic rendition. The sketches contained officers and high command, as well as the fact that civilian death was rampant in the war. Interestingly, we do not actually know who J.M. is, other than he was a member of the Royal Horse and Royal Field Artillery, was based in France and Belgium near Ypres, survived the war, and obviously had the initials J and M. Other than that, nothing is known, and all the sketches on screen are of him. German Corpse Factory. You probably think, what? But yes, there was an actual propaganda myth going around the Allied ranks that the Germans repurposed dead bodies to ship off to Kadaververwertungsanstalten. Yes, an actual German word. Literally, animal carcass utilization factory. Rumors spread as early as 1915 in northern France and Belgium, but was not represented as an actual fact and simply what they heard out and about. But in April 1917, the Times and the Daily Mail published shocking reports claiming an actual location of a corpse factory where the Germans were boiling down the bodies of their own soldiers to produce industrial material like glycerin and lubricants, which would then be processed into soap, candles, explosives, margarine, or even lamps. This, however, was a translation of a German article commenting on the bad smell of a cadaver. A cadaver in German refers to animal corpses, carcasses, for which there were actually factories processing these carcasses to break down into oil. The editors mistranslated this, but it was too late. The rumor already spread, and more newspapers published this horrifying myth. The story never had any eyewitnesses and was very obviously fabricated, but the British hoped to take advantage of the story regardless. They made up reports of people seeing trainloads of corpses being shipped off to processing plants and spread these in neutral countries like the Netherlands and China. The latter was hoped to join the war effort due to this. They did, but not because of the story. The sad side effect of the story is that because the story was obviously fake and a major war crime, people did not take reports out of Nazi concentration camps in World War II seriously when they surfaced, saying they were too similar to the story in the last war. There is no doubt that if the propaganda was not spread this way and the story misinterpreted, thousands of Jewish lives could have been saved. The credibility would not be undermined, and help could have come potentially much quicker. Mafia. Since this is spelled with two Fs, I believe this is referring to the Czech Mafia, a secret organization by Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk in 1914, who later became the first president of independent Czechoslovakia. This organization was based on the principles of the Sicilian Mafia, aiming to disintegrate Austria-Hungary and overthrow its monarchy to ensure Czechoslovakia's independence. Their plot was uncovered by police in late 1914 and early 1915, leading many key figures to escape into France and Switzerland, continuing their subversive activities there. The organization had around 200 members at its peak. Masaryk in particular fled to Paris, where he then established contact with the US and formed the National Czechoslovak Council in 1916. This council was key to guarantee independence, as France and the US later recognized this council as the highest body of governing Slovaks and Czechs. The Mafia and the National Czechoslovak Council was supported heavily from abroad, like Italy and France, but more importantly, the US, especially due to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and his ideas of self-determination. In September 1918, the US government sent a diplomatic note to Masaryk recognizing the council as the de facto government of an independent Czechoslovakia. This prompted Masaryk to proclaim Czechoslovak independence on September 26, 1918. The Lost Sandringhams. Now, I realize I'm an idiot, because when I was looking at this iceberg and adding my own entries, I apparently missed this one somehow. And the Sandringhams refer to the earlier entry in the last part, which I named the 5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, so I already had covered it in the last part. So I'm just gonna skip it. If you guys want to see it, check out the last part. Semirichia Revolt. The Semirichia Revolt, I think that's how you pronounce it, more well known as the Central Asian Revolt, was a mass revolt in Russian Turkestan, modern-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. During the 18th century, Russia subjugated a bunch of kingdoms and chiefdoms in the area and installed colonial regimes. Even though they all made up around 10% of the population in Tsarist Russia and were taxed, they did not have a single seat in the Duma, the Russian parliament. Probably rings a bell to you American viewers. In 1916, during the Brusilov offensive, a large Russian offensive on the Eastern Front, Tsar Nicholas II wanted to conscript new men for the front and wanted to draft all Central Asian men aged 19 to 43 to be sent to labor battalions to aid the Russians in this offensive. This rightfully outraged the population. In addition to unfair land distribution, bribery by Russian officers to exempt some people from being drafted, calls for Muslims to fight a holy war against Russian rule, and the fear of being used as quote-unquote human shields during trench warfare. The first real casualties of the revolt happened on July 3rd to 4th, 1916, where an angry mob attacked Russian officials. They were promptly shot at by the Russian military. Fighting spread to other regions and martial law was even proclaimed in some regions. Over the following months, purges were done by Russian officials, and entire settlements populated by Russians or Cossack settlers were burnt down by insurgents. It was all very brutal. As a response, around 30,000 soldiers armed with machine guns and artillery were diverted from the Eastern Front and sent to deal with the insurgents. Over the months, the rebellion was crushed, but some pockets of resistance were putting up a fight even months later, some surrendering as late as January 1917, before 6 months after the first fighting began. The death toll is highly disputed, but I found numbers from anywhere between 40,000 to 500,000 Central Asians dying in the revolt. Some even say that as much as 40% of the Kyrgyz population perished, a staggering figure by any definition. On the Russian side, sources say around 2,000 Russian civilians died and another 1,000 went missing, while a few hundred soldiers died. Additionally, tens of thousands of Central Asians crossed the Chinese border to escape Russian rule or to escape revolting people. In 2016, a full century later, the Kazakh government acknowledged the 1916 crackdowns as a genocide, and it very well can be considered one, while the head of the Russian Duma denies this label, saying, quote-unquote, all nations suffered 100 years ago. Quite a stupid thing to say, but I digress. Boomerang grenades. Yes, you heard that right. There was actually a design made for a grenade in the shape of a boomerang by none other than an Australian named G.V. Russell, a Melbourne engineer who proposed this idea and tested this in August 1915. This sounds like a terrible idea at first, but hunting boomerangs are not supposed to return to the thrower at all, and neither would this boomerang grenade. It would fly further than a traditional grenade, but would fall down vertically when traveling far enough. Initial tests by an expert boomerang thrower proved pretty effective, but when tested by regular soldiers on dummies, results became more inconsistent. This boomerang was quite heavy as it was made out of metal, and a large load of explosives would be glued onto it, so giving it a lot of spin was very important so it wouldn't just drop down mid-flight. Only very proficient throwers would be able to do that consistently. A regular conscript would not be. The boomerang would have been pretty effective at clearing out trenches, as it would drop straight down or return slightly and be stuck at the top part of a trench. So even though this sounds like an insane idea, it actually made a lot of sense, but was scrapped due to the aforementioned difficulties in reproducing consistent results. Maritz Rebellion. The Maritz Rebellion, also known as the Boer Revolt or the Third Boer War, was an armed uprising in South Africa in late 1914, led by Boer officials and soldiers who opposed South Africa's entry into World War I and their invasion of German Southwest Africa on the side of Britain. The causes of this rebellion go further back than this though. During the Second Boer War, fought between 1899 and 1902, the British Empire defeated and annexed the two Boer republics, essentially exiling the Boer population there. Boers were mainly ethnically Dutch descendants of the Dutch East India Company living in South Africa, and they did not see themselves as British. When the Second Boer War neared its end, many of the soldiers resorted to guerrilla warfare to put up a last stand, and this really cemented the rivalry between the Boers and the British. In any case, these guerrilla fighters and other sympathizers saw World War I as an opportunity to rebel against the British and reinstate their Boer state. Several Boer officers, including Manie Maritz, the men this rebellion was named after, Christian Friedrich Byers, Jan Kemp, and Christian de Wet, defected to the German colonial government and joined the rebellion in October 1914, disobeying orders and openly declaring an independent and free South Africa. They waged guerrilla warfare, taking over supply hubs, arms, ammunition, and money. The government declared martial law on October 12th, and over the next few weeks, the rebellion was eventually crushed by commanders Jan Smuts and Louis Botha. Of around 32,000 British forces, only approximately 100 were killed, while the 12,000-man large rebellion suffered around 500 deaths, a lot due to illness. Wild Men of No Man's Land. The Wild Men of No Man's Land refers to yet another myth, surfacing at the start of World War I. Some soldiers recall seeing deserters making a home in the desolate no man's land, slipping into abandoned trenches to scavenge for leftover food and loot to stay alive. These men are said to have gone feral, living like beasts inside shell holes and being unshaven, half naked, animalistic, and speaking another foreign language and losing their sanity. They are said to look ghoulish, lived among the dead, and only came out at night to plunder and kill anyone who stepped into no man's land. Some even recount hearing screams or gunshots at night. As one British lieutenant colonel put it, British, French, Australians, German deserters who lived there underground, like ghouls among the mouldering dead, and who came out at night to plunder and to kill. In the night, mingled with the snarling of carrion dogs, my soldiers often heard inhuman cries and rifle shots coming from that awful wilderness, as though the bestial denizens were fighting among themselves. With the most myths during World War I, this one was likely just psychological trauma and confusion, soldiers suffering from shell shock, delirium, or hallucinations. These men might have mistaken wounded men or shadows for something inhuman, or might have mistaken hearing things that weren't there, quite common for someone fighting days on end with little to no rest. However, this myth might have been created as a cautionary tale, to prevent anyone from stepping into no man's land, even at night, as the beast will grab you by your leg and pull you into the trenches. In my eyes, this myth symbolized the absolute collapse of any resemblance that is civilization or society at the front lines, where soldiers, trapped between the living and the dead, became beastly creatures of the war itself. Stab in the back myth. Here we finally are, the very last tier. The stab in the back myth, or Dolchstoßlegende in German, was a powerful conspiracy theory claiming that the German military had not been truly defeated on the battlefields, but was instead betrayed by internal enemies, sabotaging military high command. I don't know why this is so low, considering this is pretty well known if you've taken a history class into post-World War I Germany, but the creator, link in the description, decided otherwise. In any case, the myth was propagated in the final months of 1918, where the military situation was collapsing, the army was retreating, beaten in battles, American troops were arriving on the front lines, morale was crumbling, revolution and mutinies were spreading, and everyone was just suffering from extreme war weariness at this point. The men just wanted to go home, not stay in the rat-infested trenches forever. The German spring offensive was going well for the Germans at the start, but was losing momentum very quickly as the Allies regrouped. Critically, the home front was dealing with strikes at this very moment, disrupting supply chains and leading to the soldiers lacking equipment at this vital moment. With the collapse of other fronts, namely the Italian front, the Ottoman front, and the Balkan front, and the capitulation of Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, the military situation looked doomed to the Supreme Army Command, and thus ordered peace negotiations with the Allies. Key in promoting this myth was Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, who was a part of the Supreme Army Command, claiming the army was still quote-unquote undefeated in the field. This is when the Supreme Army Command began to shift away the blame from themselves and crafted this narrative of betrayal. Ludendorff said this on the 1st of October 1918. I have asked His Majesty to include in the government those circles who are largely responsible for things having developed as they have. You will now see these gentlemen move into the ministries. Let them be the ones to sign the peace treaty that must now be negotiated. Let them eat the soup that they have cooked for us. Here he is blaming Republican politicians who would soon form the Weimar government, but particularly socialists, communists, liberals, and Jews were blamed, with Jews taking the brunt of the blame. This myth became a huge political instrument by right-wing nationalists later on, who used it to delegitimize the Weimar government and was a later core principle of early Nazism. Hitler wrote in his second book in 1928, quote, and which was more certain dishonor for our people, the occupation of German areas by the enemy, or the cowardice with which our bourgeoisie surrendered the German Reich to an organization of pimps, pickpockets, deserters, black marketeers, and hack journalists? They are not the enemies of war, but they are the representatives of the November crime, that collection of Marxist, democratic pacifists, destructive traitors of our country, who pushed our people into its present state of powerlessness. As you can tell, the myth had widespread consequences, so much so that in World War II, the Allies specifically wanted to avoid the propagation of another such myth, making the German government surrender unconditionally instead of inviting them to the discussion table. The stab-in-the-back myth was a political weapon, one that reshaped 20th century history by turning Germany's military failure into a story of national betrayal, paving the way for Hitler's rise and the horrors that followed. Hound of Mons. You heard of the Angel of Mons, but have you ever heard of the Hound of Mons? Well, the Hound of Mons was allegedly seen at the same Battle of Mons the angels were seen as well. On the 10th of August 1919, Canadian veteran F.J. Newhouse published a story in a popular magazine named The Hound of Mons. According to Newhouse, he got hold of secret military accounts where the deranged German scientist Dr. Gottlieb Hochmuller created a weapon to sway the war into Germany's favor. This scientist allegedly roamed from asylum to asylum with an unquenching hatred for the British, and then inserted his brain into the skull of a Siberian wolfhound. The madman died, but the beast was growing stronger, and when finally ready, it was sent out into no man's land. In the night of November 14, 1914, Captain Jeskes and foreman of the London Fusiliers entered no man's land near Mons for patrolling duties, and never returned. Days later, their bodies were found, with bite marks on their throats, and British soldiers allegedly heard hellish screams and howling during that night. As the story goes, for 2 years afterward, the Hound of Mons attacked British patrols and preyed on them, while soldiers in the trenches only saw bleak figures in the night, doing quick movements, howling, and then disappearing into the night. Newhouse claims that the Hound was killed or left in 1916, which is when the Germans started losing, according to him. Importantly, Newhouse never claimed this was fiction, but real military documents that were shown to him, but never showed up again after that, allegedly destroyed after the war. It's honestly an interesting story, another one of those legends that might have some true core to them. Dogs were used in World War I as medical personnel, and perhaps soldiers have mistaken one of those dogs as a beastly hound, along with all the other propaganda myths propagated by the Allies in World War I, and the fear the general public had, like the German corpse factory or the crucified soldier. People were on edge and inserted their psychological trauma in the narrative of the war. So, was the Hound of Mons a real creature, perhaps a cryptid, living between the trenches and feasting on unassuming Allied troops, or just mass hysteria and trauma? Prince the dog. Prince was a half-Irish terrier, half-collie mixed dog who lived with James Brown and his wife near Cork, Ireland. Brown left for military service in September 1914 and joined the 1st Battalion, North Staffordshire Regiment, where it was common sight to see Prince walking alongside the marching soldiers. Brown and his unit were inevitably moved to the front lines in Flanders and left Prince behind with his wife to care for him. However, in November, Prince went missing and Mrs. Brown could not find Prince whatsoever, so she wrote a letter to her husband, which took around 2 weeks to arrive. Brown replied to his wife that everything was alright and Prince was with him, safely sheltered in a trench. Since Prince was used to soldiers marching in formation for long distances, he could have seen the unit marching all the way to the English Channel and followed them, hopping onto a ship with the unit and stationed in a trench with his owner. Or another soldier could have recognized Prince and brought him to James Brown to reunite the pair. In any case, Prince was in the trenches along with Brown and was great at killing rats, a huge problem in the dirty and muddy trenches of the front lines, allegedly killing as many as 137 rats a day. His party trick was to balance a penny on his nose while the men called out names of other regiments. When they called out North Staffordshire, he would toss the penny in the air and catch as it dropped, then bark, demanding a treat. These stories, however, should be taken with a pinch of salt, as no real evidence exists supporting these. Prince was brought back to England in 1919, then died peacefully after chasing and catching a mouse on July 8, 1921. California's War on Squirrels. In 1918, an unusual campaign was started by the California State Commission of Horticulture to savor on rain, the so-called War on Squirrels. California's ground squirrel population, the type of squirrel that would burrow into the ground, had exploded during the mid-1910s, causing catastrophic crop damage. They ate grain, undermined irrigation systems, burrowed through dikes and levees, costing the state around $30 million worth of crops back then, around $480 million today. The campaign was announced in late March 1918 and called school children to arms, equipping them with rodenticides to spray around their burrows or shooting them. In total, around 34,000 posters and 500,000 leaflets were distributed across California, depicting the squirrels as German, wearing Pickelhauben, the stereotypical German soldier's helmet early in the war, and framing them as actual soldiers and military combatants needing to be killed for the war effort. The Squirrel Week, they called it, was announced across schools in California, where school children would participate in a contest to slay as many squirrels as possible and bring their tails as proof of kills, earning badges, recognition, and prizes for the first 3 placing children. The first place would have earned $50, $800 today. When Squirrel Week ended May 4th, children across the state had turned in 104,509 squirrel tails, though the number of actual kills may be much higher. Funnily enough, children kept turning in squirrel tails for a quote-unquote indefinite period, the commission reported. I'd just like to imagine the county bureaus getting hundreds of squirrel tails a day, and them just stockpiling them or whatever. One girl reportedly brought in a staggering 3,780 squirrel tails somehow. In the end, the operation was deemed a great success, as crop harvests began to bounce back up after the extermination. But even today, brown squirrels are considered a great nuisance, so nature wins at the end of the day. Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. Here we are, the final entry. This guy is a complex personality, so I'll try to condense the story down. Bear with me. Baron Roman Nikolai Maximilian von Ungern-Sternberg, born in 1885, was born into an aristocratic family in Graz, Austria, in the Baltic German minority, but later moved to Estonia and lived most of his childhood there. His first language was German, but also was fluent in Russian, Estonian, French and English. He also had Hungarian roots, so keep that in mind, it becomes important later on. In his early life, Roman was considered a bully by many children, fearing him for his violence. Here he also developed a mean cruelty towards animals, and even tried to strangle his cousin's pet owl for no particular reason other than his love for torturing animals. In high school, he often disobeyed orders and broke rules, getting into fights with others, and almost getting expelled. His parents chose to withdraw him from that school, and he joined the Russo-Japanese War, though it is unknown whether he actually saw fighting himself. In his teen years, he developed a hate toward the working class people, calling them rough, wild, and constantly angered. Even though he descended from German nobility, he was extremely proud of being a Russian aristocrat, boasting about it to his peers. In military school, he became obsessed with Buddhism and dabbled a lot in the occult, later asking to be stationed in the Russian Far East to learn more about Asian culture. Roman spent a lot of time in Mongolia, where he got to experience nomadic culture, and subsequently became obsessed with anything Mongolian. Some Mongolians he was living with considered him being a deity, specifically an incarnation of the god of war, or even an incarnation of Genghis Khan. He developed a habit of heavy drinking and got into fights with others, like in his earlier years, and was scarred on his face with his sword after one such brawl. At the start of World War I, he was stationed at the Galician front, near modern-day Poland, against the Austro-Hungarians, and participated in the invasion of East Prussia in 1915 to 1916. Even though he was an extremely decorated soldier, gaining 4 medals, he was expelled and sentenced to 2 months in prison after getting into a drunken rage where he attacked another officer. When he was released in January 1917, he spent time at the Caucasus Theater against the Ottomans, where he met a man who later became his close friend, Grigory Semyonov. He and Semyonov raised an army of local Assyrians who fought against the Ottomans. This success led to both of them traveling to the Far East once again, to raise an army over there. After the October Revolution and the outbreak of the Russian Civil War, both Semyonov and Roman pledged their allegiance to the Whites, led by Alexander Kolchak. Roman and Semyonov became increasingly distant to each other, especially because of political differences. Roman believed the Russian monarchy should be entirely restored, with the Tsar having no constitution to which he would be bound to, while Semyonov wildly differed from that. Roman had a tendency to act on his own, and had no real interest whether or not his subordinates listened to his command, which highly impacted his military strength. But nevertheless, he had driven out the Bolsheviks in Transbaikalia and Hailar. He broke up his allegiance with Semyonov and moved into Inner Mongolia, which was largely under Chinese control at the time. His around 1,500 men of Russian, Cossacks, Mongolians, Buryats, and a few Japanese were rigorously trained, given harsh punishment when they disobeyed. This is when he was given the nickname the Mad Baron. In one instance, a disobeying soldier was actually burned at the stake. Over time, he gained control of Urga, modern Ulaanbaatar, and many other key cities while being vastly outnumbered, proclaiming Mongolia was thus a monarchy under the Bogd Khan. He raided these cities and even led mass executions, especially to the Jewish population living in these areas. However, Roman's taste of power quickly began to fade as the Bolsheviks entered Transbaikalia and took over Mongolia due to their far superior equipment. And in September 1921, after a long show trial, Roman was executed by firing squad, and soon after, Mongolia fell to communism. Overall, Roman von Ungern-Sternberg is an incredibly controversial figure, having extreme monarchist beliefs to revive dead empires, being very brutal to not only his own soldiers, but also the local populace. John Jennings, a history professor at the United States Air Force Academy, called him, quote, one of the worst military leaders in history, unquote, as he drove out the Chinese in Mongolia, possibly the only forces could have withstood the Soviets in their conquest of Mongolia. In the end, he was a madman, a man obsessed with the occult, wanting to revive a dead empire, and wanting to realize his dreams of an absolutist monarchy with him at the helm. And that was it, my dear friends. That was the World War I Iceberg explained. We covered a total of 69 entries. Very nice. Starting from well-known offensives and events to weird and obscure personalities, concepts, and mysteries. I really hope you enjoyed my first shot at an iceberg. Many more deep dives like this will come soon, but leave some ideas as to what you want to see me cover next in the comments below. I may consider them. I took a long time making this, and my script is almost 40 pages long, so I appreciate if you drop a like or subscribe to the channel. But thank you for watching this monstrosity anyways. That is the most important part. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!